Ian, welcome.
Vinny, good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. Why is geopolitics important to investors?
You know, it's not always as important as it is right now. Usually, geopolitics is really important for people focused on parts of the world that are intrinsically unstable, the Middle East, emerging markets, cross-border tensions, that kind of thing. But right now, we're heading through a bust cycle, what I call a geopolitical recession, where the old US-led order is actually unwinding. In other words, I mean, the U.S. is still stable domestically. I mean, if we have Trump for another term or not, that's not going to matter that much to domestic policy. But what happens with the world, the idea that you've got major trade tensions between the U.S. and all of its major allies, and between the two largest economies in the world, the U.S. and China. You have NATO in much weaker condition than it was historically. The ability to respond to crises when they emerge. After 9/11, after the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. came together, the allies came together, even our antagonists. The Russians after 9/11 supported the U.S. The Chinese after 2008 were constructive in the G20. But today, next time we have a crisis, you're not going to see that. You're going to see an unwind and finger pointing inside the U.S. You're going to see the allies much weaker. You're going to see the Chinese and the Russians taking advantage, trying to build new architecture or trying to create, in the case of the Russians, more chaos. That's why geopolitics matters. If you look forward over the next 5-10 years, the single question that most investors are most uncertain about in terms of driving macro market strategy is actually geopolitics. It's not economics.
The economic consequences therefrom.
That's right.
Exactly. Let's look at some, and by the way, what you're describing sounds very much like, and we're going to get into it in a little bit, GZERO.
That's right.
Okay, exactly. Let's take a look at some of the geopolitical type of issues that are out there, touch upon a few, macro trends that are there, and I'm sure we'll weave it into, the whole GZERO concept. Globalization, a little bit more like deglobalization is going on, and that's kind of what you're describing, to a good extent too.
Well, I mean, certainly people are moving and ideas are moving and capital's moving around the world faster and faster. That's certainly true. And if you want to talk about, sort of early stage industrialization, oil, gas, commodities, rare earths, I don't see deglobalization happening there. I actually see markets continuing to become more integrated. But if you start talking about manufactured goods and services, there I see labor becoming less important to supply chain, and I see supply chains becoming shorter. And especially after the next economic downturn, and given the fact that the Chinese are becoming more competitive and they don't have rule of law, I actually see some level of trajectory, momentum away from further globalization. But the most important point is the most advanced part of our economy, which is technology, chips, 5G, big data, the cloud. And there we actually see globalization literally falling apart. We see two completely different competitive systems, one being driven by the Chinese, the other largely being driven by the Americans, and they don't interact. I mean, everyone's complaining right now in China that the Americans are trying to get rid of Huawei, which is their major, sort of technology company driving 5G.
Right.
But if you're Amazon or Google, which are functionally American monopolies in their space, they don't even have access in the world's largest internet market, China. That's not globalization. That's not the World Wide Web. That's a splinter net, and it's completely different from what advocates of globalization and the free market were hoping was going to happen in the 21st century.
Trade wars figuring into all of this, interconnected with this, wouldn't you say?
Well, trade wars are a part of this, but the Americans and the Chinese fundamentally need each other in trade. We want to buy Chinese goods. They want to sell them to us. And one of the reasons why Trump, despite talking about putting tariffs on the remaining $325 billion of Chinese exports to the U.S., has been reluctant to do so because those are products that American consumers actually buy. It's clothing, it's toys, it's your iPhone. And if he does that, American voters are going to feel it. So he's very reluctant. And that's why, despite the fact that there's no breakthrough deal as of yet between the Americans and the Chinese, he's actually put a ceiling on further escalation. So yes, the populism and nationalism that we see, not just in the US, but in many democracies around the world, developed and developing, is leading to some more protectionism. But the fact is that the interconnection of international trade is still a driving force in the economy.
Driving force that's there. Multilateral agreements, part of the picture here too, disintegrating into bilateral agreements. Where do you see the trends in that happening as it ties in with everything that you're describing?
It's very hard for leaders of advanced industrial economies to convince their populations that more free trade is good for them. So the average member of the working class and the middle class may see that the markets are doing really well and may see that the top 10%, 1%, 0.1% have done really well. But to the extent that their wages have been flat for decades now, telling them that NAFTA or the Trans-Pacific Partnership is good for them doesn't really cut the mustard. That's true in the US. Bernie Sanders would have opposed the TPP. Hillary Clinton was an architect but said she'd have to change it before she'd push it through Congress. Trump, of course, famously said, I'm ripping it up, and Obama couldn't get it done. That's also true in Europe. It's true in lots of wealthy democracies. Interestingly, you've got a lot of populism and nationalism in countries like Mexico and Brazil, but their working and middle classes have benefited from globalization, and they see it. Those are the ones that got the jobs, that left the United States and Europe. So even though they are voting in anti-establishment, anti-corruption figures, there's no problem promoting free trade. And in Mexico, the new US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is a little bit like NAFTA Prime, is very popular among pretty much the entire population.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned corruption. To shift gears a little bit, what about the rise of illiberal democracies? You have many governments now emerging where you have autocrats at the core, benefiting from what appears to be superficially a democracy. I think you can think of Russia in that regard, and other countries too. They vote, the people vote for so-and-so, and there's an operation that seems to be happening within those countries, having to do with perhaps illicit funds and money and kleptocrats and things of that sort. Thoughts on that?
Well, so it's interesting. First of all, I would not consider Russia an illiberal democracy. I would consider them a functional authoritarian regime. Okay. There are no meaningful opposition parties in Russia. The Russian government controls all the media that matters. And as a consequence, if the Russian people wanted to potentially vote for someone other than Putin, they really don't have the opportunity to. In the case of Turkey, you have a democracy with relatively weak democratic institutions and a would-be autocrat, former prime minister, now president, Erdogan, trying to dismantle that system so that he can run it, right? Mm-hmm. And he's failing. That's really interesting.
That is.
Like, he's tried really hard, and Lord knows there's a lot of corruption around his family and around his, sort of business network, and yet there was an attempted coup against him. It failed. And yet, he couldn't get his own guy as the mayor of Istanbul, despite two tries, two bites at the apple in their elections. And some of his most important former supporters are now leaving his AK party, and they're developing alternative political movements in the same space, the center-right, to go against him. In other words, I think we're seeing the tipping point away from Erdogan. I don't think he's going to be running that country in another sort of 5 to 10 years.
But we're not seeing the tipping point of autocrats, though, are we?
No.
Maybe him
autocrats
here and there, but
autocrats are becoming stronger in many of their countries because, number one, you don't have this cohesive free world order that's actively promoting human rights and democracy. They're not leading by example. Number two, technology is increasingly empowering autocrats to surveil their populations and sort of nudge their behavior into ways that are more stabilizing for that political regime. But my point on Turkey is that for those in the United States that believe, oh my God, if Trump gets a second term, we're no longer going to be a democracy, the facts belie that. When Trump says, I want to change the way we think about the census, he fails, he has to back away. When Trump says, I don't like the way the Fed's behaving, I don't want an independent central bank, Jay Powell says, if he tells me to quit, I'm not leaving. I mean, so far, 2.5 years of Trump, he's divided the country an awful lot. Mm-hmm. He's caused a lot of internal angst and even some real anger, but he's not actually done anything to the institutions, and I think that's really important.
And speaking of institutions, there seems to be a considerable amount of faith in the institutions. Take, for example, central banks. Many investors, they go to the central banks, don't fight the Fed. They believe that the central bank is going to be there, and it will be the savior of the economy. Is there a little bit too much faith in institutions?
I mean, I don't think that the central bank is the savior of the economy. I think that you have a lot of concerns that a lot of people are not benefiting from the economy.
Right.
And ultimately, economies are built on people. And when you have an environment where a lot of those people are left out and are no longer viable or vital to that, they're no longer to be, and you don't measure their inputs, they get angry, and that undermines the system. So, capitalism doesn't work for people that don't have capital. And fundamentally, most Americans today don't have capital. Therefore, they're oriented towards things other than capitalism. So I think that if you want to talk about the economy, and not just how the markets are doing, but the whole economy, you're talking about human beings. And so central banks cannot be the saviors of that. But I do believe that central banks continue to operate largely as they have through the post-war globalization period. In other words, they're run mostly by technocratic economists who share a skill set. They're very aligned with each other, and they are largely independent from the political figures that are being elected to run nominally those governments. And in that regard, their tools to respond to a crisis may be more limited because interest rates are low right now, so they can't go that far.
And their balance sheet is pretty sizable.
And their balance sheet is problematic, right? Although when we talk about the balance sheet, everyone talks about sovereign deficits. People don't talk as much about the assets on the sheet, what these governments own. We do when we invest in corporations. So I don't understand quite why we don't. I mean, I have no problem with deficit spending in the US if we're investing in things that will bring a return long term, like infrastructure and human capital. The problem is we're not. And that makes me feel like the US economy is losing some of its strength.
Do you feel, though, in terms of institutions writ large, okay, the concept of institutions, being there as the backstop for bad behavior. That's the point that I'm trying to get to with that. In other words, I had a debate with the former president of the Minneapolis Fed. And the debate that I had with him was about the fact that central banks' actions backstop bad behavior, or what would be perceived as bad behavior by many. Any thoughts on
They
that?
backstop the existing system, and the existing system has many excesses. I mean, if you're telling me that post-2008, we didn't do an awful lot to change the way banking worked, if you tell me that some of capitalism is actually predatory, and that indeed a lot of special interests, particularly in the United States, capture the regulatory process, that there's far too much money spent on lobbying, and that Congress people, upon retirement, join that and have to position themselves to ensure that they have future well-being, and as a consequence are complicit. Those are very significant problems. I would not put them at the feet of the central bank. I'd put them at the feet of a system that is no longer feeling like a representative democracy. That's a problem.
You mentioned in one of your writings, I believe it was, if not the TED Talk, about a very tense 10 years between China and Russia. What do you mean by very tense? What's the sense of that tension? How far does that tension go over this 10-year time period?
China's ascendant, Russia's in decline. China's investing not only in its own domestic human capital and infrastructure, but also they are the most strategic with a plan, investing in infrastructure and technology outside their country. The countries where they're investing the most are their Eurasian and Asian land masses. In other words, not America's neighborhood, Russia's neighborhood. Now, right now, Russia sees China as useful because they're so angry at the United States and undermining their influence. But medium to long term, 5 to 10 years, the reality of Chinese economic dominance around Russia, whose economy is smaller than Canada's right now, smaller than Italy's, right? Despite all their military weight, that's increasingly going to feel like a threat. And anti-Chinese racism in Russia is real, and the demographic imbalance with 1.4 billion Chinese and a lot of Russian land that's largely unpopulated. So it's hard to see that not becoming much more tense in the relatively near future.
In the relatively near future. And Belt and Road exacerbates this.
Of course, because Belt and Road is the Chinese strategy to ensure that all of that money is spent in a way that is politically leverageable and useful to Beijing. All belts, all roads lead to China.
And before we leave the general geopolitical area, how consequential do you think next year's U.S. election is going to be?
To the emotional well-being of Americans, it'll be greatly consequential, and I think that matters. I mean, we're talking about a few 100 million people, and they matter to you and I, right? And they've been driven completely nuts by how much they increasingly hate each other within families, right? They're fighting. They can't watch cable news. I mean, there's not one narrative, it's not one story. We don't know what we stand for as a country anymore. So that's disturbing, right? But if you ask me how much does it matter to policy, not that much. I mean, you know, Trump's policies in his first couple of years kind of look like Republican policies. I mean, he talks about things like building a wall that Mexico's going to pay for. First of all, we've had a wall before. Building a little more wall is something most administrations have generally supported, but he hasn't really changed immigration policy fundamentally. Most of what he's done that's consequential, lower corporate taxation, regulatory rollback, more limited enforcement, his judicial appointees, his Fed appointees, not the people he's talked about, the one he's actually appointed, Marco Rubio would have done the same thing. Jeb Bush would have done the same thing. So I think the only thing Trump's done that's really surprising as a new Republican, because he wasn't for long, as you know, is probably his deficit spending, which feels more Democrat-like, though it's heavily focused on national security and defense. That's more Republican supported. But you know, it's really his lack of character. It's really his divisiveness, his ability to control the media and force them to focus only on him and not on other things. That's where Trump has an impact on the national psyche of the United States, but on the actual function of the American economy, virtually none.
I wonder what the feedback loop will be. We'll find out. We'll find out how the whole thing plays out. GZERO as a concept. I just want to read from your TED Talk, which, by the way, I thought was excellent.
Thank you.
A fundamental truth of the GZERO is that even though the U.S. is not in decline, it is getting objectively harder for the Americans to impose their will, even have great influence on the global order.
Right.
When I read this and I heard you speak it, it made me think of Joseph Nye, Harvard.
Soft power guy.
Yeah, soft power guy,
Absolutely,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. That's part of the equation that doesn't get talked a whole lot about. Thoughts on how that, and elaborate on into the whole G0 concept, if you would.
So the G0 is the absence of global leadership. We talk about the G7, the G20, these constellations of major global leaders, implying that there is some level of order. And post-World War II, there was an order imposed by the U.S. with its allies, American capital, American standards, American values, that got us the United Nations, it got us the World Trade Organization, it got us the IMF, got us the World Bank. That was this liberal order with a lot of hypocrisy, and a lot of marginal countries that didn't matter economically weren't a part of it. I mean, you know, Rwanda experienced genocide despite the liberal order, right? We get all of that. But still, in terms of the way globalization functioned, there was such an order. That order is now unwinding. And it's unwinding for two reasons. First, because the United States and advanced liberal democracies writ large, increasingly their populations see their own institutions as illegitimized and not representing them. The establishment in the political field, the mainstream media, the CEOs, the bankers, the public intellectuals, all of them. And at the same time, the world's second largest, soon to be largest economy, the Chinese, are building an alternative. They don't want to align with the standards and values of the Americans. They're state capitalists, they're authoritarian. Put those two things together, you get a G0. That's where we are. Right? And so that means that even though the United States has the dominant global currency, even though the United States is now the world's largest energy producer, even though the U.S. is the largest food producer, and even though we are geopolitically in a great part of the world without a lot of conflict, a lot of arms races in our region, the fact is that we're losing a lot of influence globally. That is a reality. We're more divided, our allies are weaker and more divided, and the Chinese are building an alternative.
You know, when you're talking 2016, he ceded everything that has happened, you know, since with the election here, and I think I think actually your TED Talk was prior to Brexit.
That's right.
Also,
that's right. Yeah. Brexit is really when you saw the geopolitical recession really emerge, right? I mean, if you want to look back and say, when did the shoes start dropping? Right. The Brexit referendum, the Italian referendum, the U.S. elections. And then you started to really see the unwind. But the structural problems were all there. They predated Trump. Trump was not the problem. Trump was the symptom. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
And the manifestation of it. Which, by the way, in 2013, I'm really struck by the title of your book, of your 10 books, I guess it is, Every Nation for Itself, What Happens When No One Leads the World. That sounds like a title that, you know, that's G0.
That's G0. That's when I first came up with the G0 concept in 2011 in an article I wrote at Foreign Affairs. It's the only time in my life I've ever actually front run a book with an article. And that was by over a year. And the reason I did that is because it was so clear that this was going to happen. I kind of assumed that other people would be picking up on it. I wanted to be out there fast. It turned out it took a long time. A lot of Americans just weren't ready for this concept because foreign policy isn't really in the psyche of a lot of Americans. Most Americans don't travel. We just don't think it matters to us. It became a massive bestseller in Japan because the Japanese were much more concerned about the Americans don't care as much about us. Oh my God, we got to deal with this rising China. Like they really felt it because they were on the sharp end of the spear.
And that then becomes the expression in the form of GZERO Media.
Yes.
Okay. Tell us about GZERO Media. People can subscribe to, which I do, Signal. Excellent commentary that's there. You have a segment also. The one
I have a show.
60 Cent. You have a show, the World.
GZERO World
GZERO
on PBS
World, right.
nationally, yeah. If you had asked me 5 years ago, I didn't think I'd be doing this. I'm doing this because I see that mainstream media is dividing our country and is dividing the world. People are watching news that they like. And it's, if you're watching CNN or Fox, or if you're on social media and you're a liberal or a conservative, there's virtually no overlap in the news, in the information that you're getting on anything, not just the Mueller investigation, on China, on immigration, on any major topic. That's horrible for our country. And it's not the way it used to be when you had, sort of 3 networks. But, the way Facebook works, the way Twitter works is you only receive information that you like because that maximizes your eyeballs. And that's great for consumption. It's great for a consumer. It's horrible for citizenship. And I started this GZERO Media company because I felt like, I've got almost 5 million followers. It's more than, it's more than nothing. And I felt like with that kind of platform, I'm sort of obliged to put information out there that can bring people together and isn't just serving the needs of the 0.1% of the population that can pay a lot of money and goes to Davos, which is what the firm was doing when I first started it.
But how do you find that nonpartisan ground where it doesn't come across as a tilt in one direction or another? Or do you provide left and right views and let,
I interview everybody. In the last few months, I've had leaders from all over the world that have, the whole political spectrum. And by the way, left and right in the United States is like this narrow compared to the global spectrum out there, right? Yeah. But in the United States, I've had Rand Paul on the right, and I've had, sort of Cory Booker on the left, and they're fairly sharp on both sides. Got some folks in the middle too. But it's not about left or right for me. It's just about being authentic. I've never been a part of a political party, which sounds kind of trendy today when people are leaving parties. But when I was 18, I never wanted to join one. I'm a political scientist. I've traveled to almost 100 countries. When you spend a lot of time outside the U.S., you realize that different people, depending on how they grew up, have different answers. Not because those different answers are right or wrong, but because it comes from your cultural context, your national
life
context,
experiences,
being brought up in the projects in my case, as opposed to sort of being in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I think that when you're honest about that, when you tell people I'm just going to call him like I see him, I don't think Trump has the character to be fit for office, but I also think he's pursued a number of policies that personally I think have been smart, and I'm willing. Trump doesn't drive me crazy, right? He doesn't. I will say this to you. I feel like, on the one hand, like Trump occupies this position of incredible privilege. He is president of the U.S. and he gets away with things that no one would get away with in this country. He says things that you'd be fired for in my firm or other firms, right? And yet he's also treated unfairly. He is. If you look at the media, they beat up on him on everything. Whether or not he's got a good idea or he's right, everything he does is horrible. Everything he does is evil. Both of those things are true. And I think that as long as you're authentic, I think people are willing to cut you a lot of slack. They're willing to disagree with you on things and still listen to you if they think you're not full of crap. And I'd like to believe that over 21 years since I started my firm, I've had a track record of being authentic with people. And I think that GZERO Media is the expression of that to the public.
It's going to be really, really interesting because this is a grand experiment that you're engaged in. It's along the lines of something that I've written about, angles and answers, that there are people that tend to want to get the angle on something, the edge on something, and then there's someone else who's really looking for the answer. And it sounds like you're more in that latter category, the providing of that answer, and then however you want to take advantage of that or utilize it, and that becomes something that that's up to the person.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's on my pinned tweet actually says, if you're not following people that you don't like, you're doing it wrong, and I'm here to help, right? And I mean, just yesterday I saw Glenn Greenwald and Ben Shapiro both posting stuff in response to my tweets in a favorable way, right? That's fairly significant. I like seeing stuff like that. I like seeing that I can put things out there that people will engage across the spectrum. I'd like to see more of it.
Yeah, we need to have that communication going. Last area to touch on with you, this is a world that is very complex, okay? And you're a person who really covers a lot of ground, an awful lot of ground. Now, investment professionals, many of whom watch this program, that they have to cover a lot of ground. Too many of them, unfortunately, distill down to certain heuristics and inputs into, you know, discounted cash flow models and stuff like that. How do you manage data? How do you discriminate? How do you know where to narrow the focus? What gets more of a priority versus something else? There's almost like, you know, like a career advice sort of thing for people that are watching.
It's hard. I mean, look, I fundamentally, I started as
I mean, you do sleep, correct?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I mean, I feel like balance is critical to this stuff. I mean, I take proper vacations, I sleep, I don't do work dinners, I work out every morning. But that's, I mean, that's just to be healthy in a job. That's not about doing analysis, that's anything. But in terms of analysis, I started off as a country analyst, as a region specialist, an area specialist. I speak Russian. I've lived in the former Soviet Union for 3 years. That's why the firm is called Eurasia Group, because back in the 90s, that's what I actually knew. As we became more global, covering emerging markets in the whole world, it wasn't like I developed different languages and different area studies specializations. I started hiring people. And those people, in turn, were providing data that, you know, I could actually carry with me. And when I traveled to those countries, first I would bring those analysts with me, and now increasingly we have offices in those countries. So scale matters. Being able to hire and train good people over time. I mean, I look at former secretaries of state who have fantastic teams and access to information, and then they leave and they've got 2 people working for them, they can't stay current, right? So first you need to have a group that's all rowing in the same direction, that understands the methodologies, and they're working and they're sharing information. And you need to have a way to filter that. You need to have people that are actually, and you need to travel. The hardest part of my job, and the part that makes me sleep less, is I'm on the road half of the time. Because I don't think you can really cover the world unless you're going to those countries and meeting those people. You have to immerse yourself in those countries. And just going to Davos for 5 days, where they're all in a bubble, doesn't cut it. You really have to go to where they are.
You have to do the time. You have to do the time and expend the energy and all. Maybe it could be a topic of your next book. Talking about, you know,
Nope,
management.
I'm working on the next book. It's not that. It's closer to my actual expertise.
Okay, great.
Good to see you, Vinny.